They dissected her identification, challenged her very presence, and summoned security, all blissfully unaware they were about to refuse the one woman who could extinguish their careers with a whisper. The notion had been a ghost in her mind for ages, a quiet suggestion at first, easily dismissed, but the more she entertained it, the more it took root, gnawing at her. Aria Valerius had forged Veridian Trust from sheer will, her bank, her very legacy. She was never just a chief executive perched in a sky-high glass sanctuary. She had poured years into cultivating an institution that was meant to be different, a place of welcome, built on a foundation of equity. But was it truly? That was the question that haunted her sleepless nights. She'd caught the murmurs before, whispers about the treatment certain clients received at certain locations, nothing overt, nothing that would ever make the news, just a feeling, an undercurrent. Stories from trusted friends, stray comments from people she respected. She had initially brushed them aside. After all, her bank had ironclad policies on fair treatment, on anti-discrimination, on superlative customer service. Yet, policies were merely hollow words on a page. True transformation is born from action, and Aria needed to see, she needed to know. Not as the CEO, not as the boss, but as a customer. And so, today, she was merely another person walking into a bank, stripped of her expensive blazer, her silk blouse, her designer heels, clad instead in a simple cardigan, jeans, and sneakers. She guided her car into the parking lot of a Veridian Trust branch in Cedar Creek, Michigan, a location she had personally championed just 3 years prior. She recalled shaking the branch manager's hand at the grand opening, posing for photographs, and delivering a speech about trust being the bedrock of genuine banking. Now, she was entering as a complete unknown. The automatic doors glided open, and the crisp sterility of freshly printed currency, an industrial-grade air freshener, washed over the lobby. Her eyes swept the room. It was a quiet afternoon. A few patrons waited in line, a couple occupied the seating area, and a teller at the far end was meticulously balancing a cash drawer. Aria shifted the bag on her shoulder and approached the counter. A young teller, perhaps in her mid-20s, with a pale complexion and dark hair bound in a severe ponytail, flickered her eyes upward. There was no greeting, not the faintest hint of a smile, just a swift, dismissive appraisal before her gaze snapped back to the monitor before her. Aria cleared her throat softly. "Hello, I need to make a withdrawal." The teller, without looking up, simply reached for a clipboard, sliding it across the polished counter with a flat sound. "Fill this out." The form was routine: name, account number, withdrawal amount, nothing out of the ordinary. Aria retrieved a pen from her bag and inscribed the details: $5,000. It wasn't a colossal sum, but it was just enough to trigger a mandatory ID verification. She pushed the clipboard back across the counter. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The teller's eyes darted across the form, then landed on Aria's driver's license. Her brows knitted together, her lips compressing into a razor-thin line. Something about that very moment felt charged, a subtle tension crackling in the air, a hesitation that had been absent mere seconds before. Aria waited, granting her the benefit of the doubt. The teller looked up again, this time truly seeing Aria's face, and then she paused, a beat too long, a moment of indecision, and in that fractured second, Aria knew. This wasn't about the money. This wasn't about bank policy. It wasn't about security. It was about who they perceived her to be. The teller's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then, as if a silent verdict had been reached, she deliberately placed Aria's ID back on the counter, away from the processing area. I'll be right back." Aria's eyes narrowed as the teller snatched the ID and strode away, vanishing through a frosted glass door that led to the manager's office. She let out a slow, controlled breath, her fingernails tapping a soft rhythm against the cool marble countertop. She had braced herself for being treated differently. She hadn't anticipated this. And a cold certainty told her this was only the beginning. But Aria Valerius wasn't going anywhere. Not until she had her answers. Aria leaned against the counter, her gaze fixed on the frosted glass door behind which the teller had vanished. The tension in the lobby seemed to coalesce, growing heavier, like an unspoken truth hanging in the air. She took another look around, absorbing the minute details. A man in a business suit stood 2 places behind her. His suit was slightly rumpled, his tie askew, looking as though he'd come directly from a long day's work. When he had stepped up moments before, a different teller had greeted him instantly. Another woman, older, in a vibrant floral dress, was chatting amiably with her teller across the lobby. No pauses, no extra layers of scrutiny. Aria turned her attention back to the empty space before her, her jaw setting. She had been standing here for almost 5 minutes now, waiting. Waiting for an explanation, waiting for something that had no right to be happening. But she understood what was unfolding. This wasn't a matter of policy. If it were, the teller would have explained the issue, she wouldn't have just walked away without a single word. This was something else entirely. The door finally swung open, and the teller emerged, but she was not alone. A branch manager trailed her, a middle-aged man with a stocky frame, a bald head, and rimless glasses. His name tag read Alistair Finch. His expression was a mask of politeness, but it was too rigid, too controlled. He wasn't approaching with the relaxed demeanor of someone eager to assist, he was evaluating. Aria knew that look intimately, she had just never been on the receiving end of it. Alistair stopped at the counter, offering her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm told you're attempting to make a withdrawal?" Aria gave a single, sharp nod. "That's correct. $5,000. My account, my ID?" Alistair's eyes flicked to the teller, then back to Aria. "Would you mind if I just take a quick look at your identification?" "Mind?" she breathed out slowly, keeping her voice perfectly level. "I already gave it to her." Alistair ignored the comment completely. He simply picked up the ID, holding it up toward the ceiling lights, studying it with exaggerated care. Then he looked back at her. "Miss Valerius, is this your first time banking with us?" A cold knot formed in Aria's stomach. The question was so delicately phrased, yet its meaning was a bludgeon. "Do you belong here?" Her tone grew sharper. "I have banked here since the day this branch opened." Alistair gave a slow, patronizing nod, as if processing a complex piece of data. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000? Aria could feel her patience beginning to fray. "That is what I wrote on the form." The lobby had grown perceptibly quieter, not silent, but hushed. A few other customers had cast glances in her direction, likely sensing the shift in the room's energy. Alistair turned the ID over in his fingers, then, without meeting her eyes, he asked, "And what is it you do for a living, Miss Valerius?" Aria let out a short, sharp laugh, born more of disbelief than humor. There it was. The moment the veneer of professionalism cracked just enough for the ugliness to seep through. She tilted her head slightly, studying him now. "I'm in finance," she stated, her voice precise. Alistair's forced smile tightened. "Oh? What kind?" Aria let the silence hang between them for a moment, then she said, "Banking." That gave him a flicker of pause, just for a second, but instead of retreating, he pressed on. "I see," he said slowly. "And this is a personal account, is that right? Not a business one?" Aria folded her arms across her chest. "That is what it says on the form." Another slow nod. Another glance at the teller. More hesitation. Then, as if reaching some unseen conclusion, Alistair placed the ID back on the counter. "Unfortunately, we won't be able to process this withdrawal at this time." Aria blinked, letting the words register. "What?" She stood up straighter. "Excuse me?" Alistair adopted a calm, measured expression. "We are unable to verify the transaction." Aria felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "You have my ID. You have my account number. What is there to verify?" Alistair clasped his hands together on the counter. "It's simply a precaution we take. We take security very seriously." Security, there it was. The word people hide behind when they don't want to speak the truth. Aria's fingers curled into her palms. This was never about fraud. This was never about banking regulations. This was about something else entirely. But she was not leaving. Not now. Not without an answer. But Alistair wasn't finished. He had one more thing to say, and when he said it, Aria knew this was about to escalate from bad to something much, much worse. Aria let his words hang in the air. We're unable to verify the transaction. Her gaze moved between Alistair and the teller, waiting, offering them a silent opportunity to correct this course. Perhaps they would realize their profound error, process the withdrawal, and allow her to leave without another word. But they remained motionless. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms flat against the cool counter. Alistair, she said, her voice a calm, firm line. What, precisely, needs to be verified? Alistair kept his hands clasped before him, his expression a careful blank. Well, Miss Valerius, large cash withdrawals necessitate additional security protocols. We just need to confirm a few details before we can proceed. Aria arched an eyebrow. Such as? Alistair hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Just some basic account verification. Can you tell me the amount of the last deposit made to this account? Aria stared at him, motionless. That was not standard procedure. Security questions were normal, yes, but that was not one of them, not for an in-person withdrawal with a valid, government-issued ID. She could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken challenge. Was this a game? A way to force her to prove she was worthy of accessing her own funds? Her fingers tightened against the marble. I don't have that figure memorized, she said, her voice even. But if you would pull up my account, as you would for any other customer, you could see all of my deposits. Alistair gave her that thin, dismissive smile again. Of course. But in the interest of security, we need to ensure the account holder can confirm certain details first. Aria's jaw clenched. I just gave you my ID. Alistair didn't so much as flinch. I understand, but you would be surprised how often fraudulent IDs come through. Fraudulent. She drew a slow breath through her nose. I'm not withdrawing millions. It is $5,000, a tiny fraction of what I hold in this account. I have already followed your protocol. So allow me to ask again, what is the actual issue here? Alistair's expression remained unchanged. We're simply performing our due diligence, Miss Valerius. Her patience was evaporating. Alistair, she said, her voice dangerously level. If I were a man in a bespoke suit, would you be asking me these questions? The words hit their mark. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps recognition, crossed his face, too fast to be certain, but it was there. A minute shift in his posture, a subtle tightening around his eyes. Then, just as quickly, the mask of detached professionalism slid back into place. This has nothing to do with appearance, he said smoothly. It is about policy. Aria let out a short, humorless laugh. Is it? Alistair tilted his head, as if weighing his next move with great care. Would you like to attempt a different method of verification? He offered. Perhaps a utility bill? A second form of photo ID? A utility bill. Aria couldn't stop the breath of disbelief that escaped her. You want me to provide a second form of ID from my own bank account, where you are currently holding my money? Alistair didn't blink. Aria shook her head, tapping a sharp rhythm against the counter. All right. Let's try this a different way. Pull up my account. Alistair hesitated. You have my name, she pressed on. You have my ID. If you check my file, you will see that I have been a client here since day one. That I helped inaugurate this very branch. That I likely signed off on some of the training manuals you use. Alistair remained silent. Aria leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice so that it carried with pointed intensity. You might want to check before you dig this hole any deeper. Alistair's lips pressed into a firm line. The teller, who had been observing in silence, shifted uncomfortably. For a fleeting moment, Aria thought he might finally relent, that he would backtrack, apologize, and handle this as it should have been handled from the very start. Instead, he let out a short, decisive breath. I'm sorry, Miss Valerius, he said smoothly. Without additional verification, we cannot process this withdrawal today. A surge of heat flooded Aria's chest, not from shame, but from a quiet, building fury. She could feel the eyes of the other customers, subtle glances that flickered toward the unfolding drama, sensing the tension but feigning indifference. She could hear the measured, condescending politeness in Alistair's voice, the kind that made it clear he wasn't worried about security in the slightest. He had already made up his mind that she didn't belong here, and nothing she could say would alter that conclusion. But Alistair had just made a critical, irreversible mistake. Because if he had simply processed the transaction, this all would have ended here. Now Aria was about to make him regret it profoundly. But before she could utter another word, Alistair did something that sent a fresh shockwave of disbelief through her, something that transformed this situation from merely frustrating to utterly infuriating. Aria barely had a moment to process before Alistair did the unthinkable. He reached under the counter, pressed a discreet button near the terminal, and summoned security. A uniformed guard, broad-shouldered with his hand resting casually near his belt, emerged from a back office. His face was a neutral mask, but Aria knew exactly what this looked like. A bank manager refusing a customer's request was one thing. Calling security was something else entirely. It was a declaration. It was an escalation. And it made her stomach clench. Aria took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing a calm she did not feel. She had encountered men like Alistair before, men who expected compliance, who saw it as their duty to remind certain people of their place. But she would not play his game. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locking with his. "You're really going to do this?" Alistair maintained his carefully neutral facade. "We simply want to ensure a smooth experience for all of our customers." A smooth experience, as if she were the one creating a disturbance. The security guard stepped closer, his voice even and measured. "Is there a problem here?" Aria turned to face him, keeping her posture relaxed. "That depends," she said coolly. "Are you here to help me access my own money, or are you here to escort me out?" The guard hesitated, glancing toward Alistair, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Aria let out a small, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "Wow! So this is how we're doing this." Alistair sighed, a theatrical display of inconvenience. "Miss Valerius, if you would like to return with additional documentation, we would be happy to assist you. But for now, we can't." Aria cut him off. "You know what's interesting, Alistair? I watched you process that man's transaction not 10 minutes ago. No extra verification. No manager called over. No security." Alistair's expression hardened. She stepped closer to the counter, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "I wonder what's so different about me." The energy in the room shifted palpably. The teller stared down at the floor, avoiding all eye contact. The security guard shifted on his feet, his stance suddenly less assured. Alistair, however, held his ground. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Miss Valerius," he said, his voice flat. "But our policies are in place for a reason." Aria held his gaze for a long beat. Then, slowly, she reached into her handbag. Alistair tensed. The security guard's hand moved closer to his belt. Aria didn't blink. She pulled out her phone and began recording. A few customers glanced over, now openly intrigued. Alistair's posture changed. "Miss Valerius, I just want to be sure I get this on record," she said smoothly, her voice clear and steady. "You are refusing to allow me access to my own account, despite my providing valid, government-issued identification, while other customers are not being subjected to these extra requirements." Alistair's jaw was a tight line of fury. Aria angled the camera slightly toward the security guard. "And you were called over for what purpose, exactly?" The guard faltered, looking to Alistair for guidance. Aria didn't move, didn't look away, didn't cede control of the moment for an instant. A heavy silence descended upon the room. And then Alistair made one final, fatal mistake. He reached out, not to grab her, not to push her phone away, but to snatch her ID from the counter, as if, despite everything, he still had to have the last word. But that was it. That was the moment. And Aria smiled. Because Alistair had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. And in about 10 seconds, he was going to wish he had handled this very, very differently. Aria let the moment hang in the air, letting Alistair feel the crushing weight of his miscalculation. He had seized her ID as if he possessed the authority, as if this was his domain to command. But it wasn't. It was hers. She angled her phone just slightly, ensuring the camera captured his face, the guard's unease, the electric tension in the room. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, she said, "Alistair, allow me to introduce myself properly." His expression twitched, the first visible crack in his composure. Aria reached for her ID, plucking it from his grasp with a deliberate, unhurried grace. She turned it over in her hand, tapping a single finger against the name printed there. "You see this? This isn't just any customer's ID." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the silence amplify them. "You're looking at the founder and CEO of Veridian Trust." The silence in the bank lobby was no longer just quiet, it was absolute. The security guard's posture deflated. The teller's face became a mask of pale shock. Even the customers who had been pretending not to listen stood frozen. Alistair, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, visibly lost control. His throat worked as he swallowed, his lips parting as if to form words, but nothing emerged. Aria took a slow step back, sliding her ID into her bag with a final, definitive click. "I built this bank," she continued, her voice resonating in the stillness. "From the ground up. I signed the approval for this branch. I personally approved the hiring budget that pays your salary." Alistair's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. His entire demeanor had shattered. Gone was the condescending politeness. What remained was raw, unfiltered panic. Aria gave him a smile devoid of all warmth. "And today, I walked in here as just another customer. Simply to see what would happen." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you know what happened, Alistair?" He couldn't answer. He could only stare. Aria let her voice drop, each word landing like a hammer blow. "I was refused service. I was lied to, humiliated, and treated as though I did not belong in my own institution." Alistair finally blinked, his mouth opening. "Miss Valerius!" Aria held up a single hand, stopping him cold. "No. You've had your chance to speak. Now you will listen." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the lobby, ensuring everyone could hear her next words. "If I were standing here in a tailored suit, if I were a man, if I looked like your preconceived notion of a CEO, you and I would not be having this conversation." Alistair's eyes darted to the security guard, a desperate, silent plea for help. The guard said nothing. The teller was staring at her register, as if it held the secrets to the universe, wishing herself invisible. Aria took a slow, centering breath, raising her phone again. "Alistair, I have a question for you," she said, her tone deadpan. "Would you prefer I send this video footage directly to the corporate office, or should I just handle this right now?" Alistair visibly paled, his mouth opening and closing twice before he managed to find his voice. "Miss Valerius, I sincerely apologize. This was just a misunderstanding." Aria arched an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" He nodded frantically. "Yes, absolutely. I can process that withdrawal for you immediately." Aria let his offer hang in the charged air for a second. Then, finally, she let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "Alistair," she said, shaking her head slowly, "you and I both know it's far too late for that." Alistair's face was ashen, because he knew, with chilling certainty, that she was right. And what came next, that was entirely up to her. But one thing was certain. His day was about to get infinitely worse. Alistair's face had been stripped of every shred of confidence. The slick, polished manager who had so casually dismissed her just minutes ago now stood rigid, his hands gripping the counter as if it were a life raft. The security guard, summoned to intimidate her, now shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Alistair and Aria, silently asking if he was still needed. Aria exhaled slowly, tapping her nails on the countertop. "Let me be sure I understand, Alistair," she said, her voice a blade of measured calm. "Just a few moments ago, my ID was insufficient. My name was insufficient. My account history was insufficient. You required more proof. You needed additional verification. She let the pause stretch, watching him squirm. "And now that you know who I am," she continued, "suddenly, none of that matters anymore." Alistair swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Miss Valerius, I sincerely regret how this situation was handled. I can assure you, this was not my intention." Aria let out a laugh devoid of any humor. "Not intentional?" she repeated. "Alistair, do you take me for a fool?" His eyes widened, but he remained silent. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she pressed on, her voice calm but sharp as glass. "You took one look at me, and your mind was made up. You decided I didn't belong here, and you erected every barrier you could think of to make sure I knew it." Alistair shook his head quickly. "Miss Valerius, I assure you, that is not what transpired." Aria held up her hand, silencing him. "No," she said, her voice like steel. "I have no interest in hearing any more of your rehearsed apologies. Because let's be perfectly clear, you are not sorry for what you did. You are only sorry that you got caught." Alistair's jaw tightened. The other customers in the lobby were no longer pretending to be oblivious. The air felt heavy, charged with the gravity of the moment, a lesson sinking into everyone present. The teller who had initiated this disaster stood frozen, staring at her register, refusing to look up. Aria turned her gaze to the security guard. "You were called over to escort me out of the building, correct?" she asked. The guard hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, ma'am. That was my understanding." She nodded. "And now that you know who I am, are you still operating under that impression?" The guard glanced at Alistair, then back at her, his stance shifting. "No, ma'am. I was just following instructions." Aria studied him for a moment. She knew how this game was played. Alistair would try to deflect, to spread the blame, to paint this as a simple overreaction, to make it all just disappear. But this was not disappearing. Aria reached into her bag and produced a business card. "Here's what is going to happen," she said, sliding it across the counter toward Alistair. "You are going to call my office. You are going to schedule a meeting with the corporate board. And you are going to explain, in exhaustive detail, why this happened today." Alistair's fingers trembled as he picked up the card. "Of course, Miss Valerius. Absolutely." Aria then turned to the security guard. "I appreciate you responding when called," she said evenly. "But I would advise you to be more discerning about which situations truly require your intervention. If a customer is not being disruptive, the first step should never be intimidation." The guard gave a small, respectful nod. "Understood, ma'am." Finally, she turned to the teller, who was still trying to fade into the background. "You," Aria said, her voice calm but firm. The young woman flinched. Aria leaned slightly over the counter. "You saw my ID. You had my account information. And you still made the decision that I was not worth your time or respect." The teller finally looked up, her eyes wide with fear. I was just following protocol, ma'am." "Then perhaps you need to ask yourself why that protocol only seems to apply to people who look like me." The teller swallowed hard and looked away. Aria took one final, sweeping look around the branch. Every customer was watching. Every employee had heard. This was never about a simple withdrawal. This was about something much, much bigger. Aria straightened her shoulders. She had made her point. But she was not finished. Because now, she was going to ensure this never, ever happened again. Aria stepped back from the counter, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile as she walked toward the exit. The silence in the bank was thick, almost suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Alistair stood frozen, her business card clutched in his trembling hand. The teller looked as though she wished the floor would swallow her whole. The security guard, once so ready to remove her, now looked deeply uncomfortable and unsure of his place. And the customers, they had abandoned all pretense of not watching. Aria paused at the door, then slowly, deliberately, turned back around. One last thing. She was not the type to let an injustice like this simply fade away. She had poured her life into building this bank, intending for it to be a place where people felt secure, respected, and valued. But today, she had received a harsh reminder that policies written on paper mean absolutely nothing if the people tasked with enforcing them don't truly believe in them. She took a slow breath, her gaze scanning the room, meeting the eyes of her employees and customers alike. Then, in a voice that was steady, clear, and impossible to disregard, she said, "This is the last time something like this happens in my bank." The weight of her words settled over the room like a physical force. Alistair flinched. The teller shifted her weight. The security guard looked at the floor. Aria continued, "I will not stand by while my customers are treated differently because of assumptions, because of bias, or because of plain, simple ignorance." Her voice never rose, but it didn't need to. Every single person was listening. "There will be changes," she said simply. "Real ones. Because if this can happen to me, the CEO, then I can only imagine what happens to the people who don't have the power to fight back." The bank remained silent. Alistair's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Miss Valerius, I assure you, do not assure me," she said coolly. "Show me." His mouth snapped shut. Aria glanced at her phone. The recording was still active. She stopped it, slipping the device back into her bag. "Corporate will be in touch," she said. "And Alistair." He stiffened. "You might want to start looking for a new job." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked out the door. The consequences were swift and decisive. By the next morning, Aria had convened an emergency meeting with her entire corporate leadership team. Every branch manager was summoned. Every single customer service policy was torn down and rebuilt. And Alistair? He was gone. But Aria did not stop there. She implemented mandatory, rigorous unconscious bias training across all branches. She introduced a new, transparent accountability system and actively encouraged customers to report any and all instances of discrimination, no matter how subtle. Within weeks, Veridian Trust began to transform. Employees were more mindful, more aware. Customers, especially those from communities who had felt ignored or dismissed in the past, began to notice a tangible difference. And Aria, she never forgot that day. Because it was the ultimate proof of a truth she had always known: real change isn't born from words on a page. It happens because someone, somewhere, refuses to accept the way things are. And today, that someone was her. If you have ever found yourself in a situation like this, or know someone who has, do not remain silent. Speak up. Call it out. And most importantly, demand change. Because the only way things ever get better is when we collectively refuse to accept anything less.